are going to get started. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Michaela Vrazdova, and I'm an immigration attorney at Scott Legal. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa category, and particularly we'll be talking about cases where the investment amount is lower or other E-2 visa categories that are considered to be risky. And we will also answer any questions that come up when during this webinar. A few things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm, and we assist individuals and companies pursuing various types of visas, anything from family-based, employment-based, or investor-based visa. And our main specialty is really assisting investors and entrepreneurs pursuing visa options, and one of them is also the E-2 visa. We'll continue to have this webinar series, and we'll continue to have at least 2 webinars a month on different visa topics. So please join us for future webinars as well. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you a few things. We'll send you a PowerPoint on the E-2 visa category. We'll send you an E-2 visa guide that will go over the E-2 visa requirements in detail. We will also send you a link where you will be able to sign up for additional future webinars. This webinar will also be available on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification button, as we often post new immigration videos on our YouTube channel. Today, regarding panelists, we are lucky to have John Barrera, who is an experienced immigration attorney and who has a vast experience processing E-2 visas. And he will be conducting the first portion of this webinar, and then I'll be conducting the second portion. And regarding any questions you have, if you have any questions about E-2 visa or about anything we kind of discuss during this webinar, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box, and we will get to them as we talk, or we'll get to them at the end of this webinar. Perfect. So why don't we get started? So John, can you tell us who can apply for an E-2 visa, who can qualify for an E-2 visa?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Sure. So then who can apply for an E-2 visa? You're looking at nationals of treaty countries. So there has to be a treaty between the United States and that specific country. Countries can vary from different regions of the world, like Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East. Some of the countries include the United Kingdom, Mexico, Canada, Japan, and Chile. But there are others that are members of the treaty. It's a pretty long list, actually. But also just keep in mind that not all countries around the world are E-2 countries. Again, they have to be treaty members, and for example, countries such as China and India are not treaty countries. Also, what's important to keep in mind is that it's based on the country of nationality. You're not really looking at country of birth. So it's really about the passport. If you have a passport from an E-2 treaty country, you're going to qualify for the E-2 visa. Perfect.
And John, so can you go over what is an E-2 visa and what are some of the key requirements for an E-2 visa?
Absolutely. So keep in mind first that an E-2 visa is considered what is called a non-immigrant visa. What that means is that this is a visa that does not have a pathway to a green card, also known as legal permanent resident status. It's a temporary visa valid for a temporary period of time, which we'll go over later. There are basically 2 main options for obtaining an E-2 visa. One is to purchase an existing business or franchise. The other is to start a business in the United States. And the purpose of the E-2 visa is always to develop and direct operations of a business in which the applicant has invested money. Also, the applicant must own at least 50% of the E-2 company. Under no circumstances can the ownership drop below 50%. Anything above 50%, there can be changes in percentage ownerships, but at the very least, the primary E-2 applicant must have a 50% stake in the company or ownership. The applicant must also make an investment in the U.S. that is considered at risk and substantial. So this is kind of like part of the scary part of the case, where the examining officer is going to expect that this money has been invested in the company. That's what we mean by at risk. When we talk about substantial, you don't really think about minimum amounts. There is no legal minimum amount. Substantial really means is the money that's necessary in starting up the business. That's really what the examining officer is going to be looking at, whether it's substantial enough, which is it the necessary amount of money to start that business or to purchase the business. And we could go over that a little bit later as well. Also, the source of the money is very important. It must come from what's considered a legitimate source, a legal source, right? And it could vary. The type of source of the money can be a gift, it could be a loan, it could be saved earnings. Just as long as it's not obtained from illegal activity, it'll probably qualify as a legitimate source. Now, the key with perhaps like a loan is documenting, what that loan is. You could use an unsecured loan, document what the requirements of the loan are and everything to show that it's legitimate. I believe the only real limitation with a loan is that it can't be based on anything that's secured by the business, the E-2 business itself. Otherwise, it could be fair game as well. The business cannot be marginal. So what that means is that it can't be created only to support the applicant or investor himself or herself or her family. The key to the E-2 is to create future employment for U.S. workers. That's really what the goal of this visa is all about. So you want to be able to show that within the next 5 years, in our cases, that the business can employ at least around 3 to 4 employees. That's what we usually recommend. But the more, the better in an application. The business must also be real and operating. What that means is that it's either taking in revenue or it's just about ready to take revenue. You're just waiting for that visa to be granted. Examples showing that the business is real and operating, for example, can be presenting a signed commercial lease, documentation showing that the business entity has been started with the state authority, creation of the company website, pending contracts with customers, and if the business requires any kind of licensing, that they have been acquired. Again, the investors coming into the U.S. to solely develop and direct the E-2 business. That's the active role that the investor needs to have. He's not working as an employee. He's working more in a managerial role. Finally, the investor has an intent to return to his own home country upon expiration of the E-2 visa. This is pretty simple to show. It's a necessary requirement, but it's pretty simple or easy to show. Usually a short declaration communicating this intent is usually sufficient in our applications.
Thanks, John. And for how long can the E-2 visa usually be issued for? For how many years?
Sure. So that's going to really depend on the country of nationality. You can say that for most treaty countries, you'll usually get the visa good for 5 years, but that can change depending on the treaty that exists with the specific country that you're applying from. Some countries have visa a visa validity period, I'm sorry, as low as or as short as 3 months. They could vary 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, again, up to the 5 years. You can, like I said before, most have the 5 year validity period, but you do have to check to make sure that's the amount of time your country's being given. Like I said, it can be shorter depending on the country. Now, another thing to keep in mind that's kind of the visa validity period is that time frame where the E-2 visa applicant is allowed to travel to the United States on that status. When you enter the United States, um, you're going to be given a visa status, and that visa status will be different. It's usually going to be for up to 2 years. That's the length of time that the applicant or the visa holder at that point will be allowed to stay within the United States. So he's got to be cognizant of that time period as well. So he's either going to have to perhaps extend status within the US or depart before the 2 years and re-enter within that overall visa validity period, whether it's 5 years or less. So that's pretty much how that works.
Thanks, John. And you touched on the kind of like the investment and the substantiality a little bit, but can you like perhaps like give some examples, like how much money is usually substantial, let's say for like a service-oriented business, and then let's say, for like a company that will be selling inventory, and just kind of like give a few examples and how kind of like the government looks at like what is a substantial investment.
Yes, absolutely. It's very important to understand what that investment amount could be. Again, we start off with the idea that, technically, legally speaking, there is no required minimum amount. We always focus on the term substantial. So that's going to depend on the type of business that you're going to be opening up. So we'll take the example, as you mentioned, Michaela, of perhaps like an office oriented business or an office-based business. We're talking maybe perhaps like an accounting firm, consulting firm, a law firm that's attempted to be started in the United States. So these type of office-based businesses, they don't typically require a large amount to open up, because you're looking at perhaps office supplies, furniture, computer equipment, lease. So you're going to be looking at about a range of about $40,000-$50,000 around there to start that type of business, just because, organically or naturally, they don't require that much money to start. Now, if your business requires, expensive machinery, it's a retail business where you're going to have to keep a large, a substantial amount of inventory, right? You're going to need a larger space. That business is going to probably have a much larger amount to require to require a larger investment amount, because that equipment, machinery, if it's a factory, or space for inventory, it's going to require more money to lease that space. So the government or the examining officer is going to be looking to make sure the substantial amount is the necessary amount for that particular business. We're looking at it another way. There is what is called a proportionality test. So when you're looking at the proportionality test, when you're looking to start up a new business, the government's going to be looking at how much money is needed for the business. How much money was invested for the business, and compare it to how much money is typically needed to invest in that type of business to start it. Then there's a proportionality test where it's relevant to buying the business. Here, the government's going to be looking at what is the fair market value for that type of business, right? How much does that type of business typically sell for? So there, you're going to probably want to get an appraisal for the business that you're purchasing to show that you're buying it for fair market value. But it's always dependent. What is the business need? If you're buying it, are you buying it at around fair market value? If you're starting a new business, are you expensing? Are you making all the necessary money investments get that business going, whether it's as little as computer equipment, or you need machinery, expensive tools for a mechanic business, things of that nature.
Perfect. And we already have a couple of questions. And they're kind of relevant to what we have talked about already. So we can go over them. So someone is asking, can an E-2 visa holder get an alien number? So I can answer, and then perhaps John, you can add if I miss something. But yeah, generally E-2 visa holders would not be able to get an alien number. The alien number, really, people who are applying for a permanent residency, like a green card, they usually get an alien number. Or like some visa holders who apply for an EAD, like a work authorization card, they can get an alien number. But yeah, as an E-2 visa holder, you wouldn't normally get an alien number. Perfect. So then someone else is asking, can the 50% ownership only be possible to have within the corporation of other person and not with the franchisee? So I'm not sure I understand the question, but basically the general rule for the 50% ownership is that, for an E-2 visa, there has to be a US company set up in the US, and the E-2 investor has to own at least 50% or more in that US company. Now with a franchise, let's say that you are buying a franchise, you would normally still buy the franchise under that US company you incorporated. So you would still have to own 50% in that US entity. So I hope I answered your question. Then the next question, perhaps John, if you have a chance. So someone is asking, would you consider a company that has invested 50,000 Canadian dollars to develop a software marketplace in Canada already and just incorporate it in the US? What is the requirement to be considered at risk? Do you have to transfer the IP to the US entity, or how do you show the investment at risk?
Okay, so I'll try to answer. It's a bit of a complex question, so I'll try to answer the best that I can. I think the main thing you have to keep in mind is that the first thing that the government's going to be looking at is the investment that's going to be made in the United States. That's and the required investment that's needed to start that type of business in the United States. Now, whether it's at risk or not, I think that's pretty easy to determine. It's essentially what's already been spent. You're now looking at a situation where you're putting money aside in a bank account where you're ready to spend it. That's not going to work. You have to have spent it. And again, it has to be necessary for starting up that business. So your question is a bit specific to your industry. We probably want to do a consultation to better answer it, but essentially what you're looking at is that if you need to make that expense, if you need to purchase an IP, if that's necessary for the business, yeah, then the government's going to want to see it. But again, I'm probably going into waters that are a little murky for me because it's more of an industry specific question, but we can work with you because part of our service is to better understand that industry to help you present the best case possible.
Exactly. Yeah. And kind of like, if already kind of like the Canadian entity made some expenditures for the E-2 visa you want to show, or you want to kind of like attribute the expenditures to the US entity. So we, would still want to see that the US entity made, all the expenditures that are necessary to kind of like start the operations in the US, such as, if you need an office space, if you need a website or all of those things, the US entity would still kind of like have to make those expenditures. Perfect. So then someone is asking, can the business be a service such as a consulting company? So yeah, John already kind of like went over the example. So, you know, consulting companies, law firms, like any companies that provide services, like all of those can definitely qualify, you know, for the E-2 visa. So that's completely fine. Then John, someone is asking, I have passports from 2 different countries, Australia and Canada. I'm currently a resident of Canada and my husband is a resident of Australia. Which E-2 country do you recommend I consider for the application? Both my husband and I will manage the business in the US. Do you think there is like a, you know, like a better option, or what are the options?
I think, and you could obviously chime in and give me your impression, Michaela, but I think either country we've had positive experiences with dealing with, because my impression of the 2 countries, Canada and Australia, is they have a significant amount of experience with E-2 visas, and they have a good understanding, and therefore we have a good understanding of what they're looking for to get an E-2 visa approved. I think what you might want to consider, though, to perhaps go through Canada, is so the negative of perhaps going through Australia. I mean, there could be logistical issues. If you know, you have to look at what could be a more easier like travel situation for you, but also you know, you have to kind of consider that if you apply as an Australian national, you're going to be hit with a higher fee. It's called a reciprocity fee potentially, which I believe is upwards of about $3,000 per application. So that could be something that'll dissuade you from perhaps applying from Australia in that scenario.
Yeah, exactly. I think, you know, like both countries, like you could apply, you know, with passport of either of these countries. But yeah, that's an excellent point. Like Australian nationals have to pay. Canadian nationals, I think, also have to pay the reciprocity fee, but it's like $100 or $200. It's kind of low. But the Australian nationals have to pay the reciprocity fee, and it's like over $3,000. So that's definitely like one thing to consider. Perfect. So then someone is asking if you want to stay in the US permanently rather than to return to your home country, can you apply for a different visa or transition to an EB-5 visa? Or is it better to apply for an EB-5 visa straight off? So EB-5 visa or EB-5 green card is, as it's clear from the name, is a green card. So definitely, if you kind of qualify for EB-5 and the petition is approved, you know, you would be granted a green card, and then you can live in the US permanently. As John kind of discussed in the beginning, the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa. Now, there is no limit as to like how many times you can extend it, and you know, you could extend the E-2 visa indefinitely. And normally to qualify for the E-2 visa, like you don't have to submit detailed evidence showing ties to your home country or anything like that. But yeah, kind of like the difference between the E-2 visa and the EB-5 is that the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa, the EB-5 is a green card. Now, if you want to do the EB-5, there is an option to kind of transition from the E-2 to an EB-5. But again, this is kind of a more complex scenario. So we would either recommend to kind of attend our webinar on the EB-5 green card, or if you want to discuss your situation in more detail, definitely schedule a consultation. Another question is, would crowdfunding be considered an acceptable form of funding? So I don't know, John, if you're familiar, but I'm not that familiar with like how crowdfunding works. For an E-2 visa, like we still need to show that you own 50% in the E-2 company, and that the investment you made in the US company comes from your personal funds. Now, if the remaining 50% is owned by you know, someone else or by multiple people, and they made their investments in the company, that's fine. But for your E-2 visa application, we would just need to show that you own 50% and that the substantial investment you made in the company, like that comes from your personal funds.
Yeah. So my understanding of crowdfunding is basically, money that's being raised through multiple sources. And it's sort of what I understand is usually an informal way of raising money. So I think at a best case scenario, I think it would be a very problematic case because you're likely to have issues in showing that it's coming from a legitimate source. It's a source that I'm sure the government is not comfortable with dealing with. So they're gonna probably give you a hard time with that. What they're looking for is, like Michaela said, they want to see a clear source. Usually saved earnings can be properly documented because you have your income tax reports. Loans are appropriate as well because they're properly documented. There's a contract with terms on it. Even a gift is appropriate as well. Although if you're going to be applying through USCIS, you probably have to also show where the donor of the gift, where he received his source of money as well in a pretty detailed manner. So because you have to, especially with the USCIS filing, where USCIS makes a greater emphasis on the source and the trail of the money, and they're going to want to see detailed documentation of that source. I think crowdfunding may be pretty problematic in a best case scenario.
Perfect. Thanks, John. And why don't we, for now, continue in the presentation, and then we'll get to the rest of the questions at the end. So, John, what are some strategies to deal with a weaker E-2 case? Like, what can you do to make the application stronger?
Sure. So it kind of depends on where your weaknesses are. I think the stronger the case is pretty much the case where you have a good investment amount to show, but where you're maybe a bit lacking in the investment amount, you want to do what you want to do is try to make up in other areas, because remember that at its core, the purpose of the visa is to create employment in the future, based on that the business has created more employment in the future, and that's what you want to show more than anything, and as well that it's a legitimate business. So what you want to try and build up is perhaps may if not so much investments, making these endeavors to setting up the business. So remember what we mentioned before, perhaps setting up the website, perhaps getting the appropriate licensings for the business, getting perhaps letters of intent from potential customers that are going to be contracting you, if not contracted already. Setting up these different things that are required for the business will also help strengthen the case in the areas that the case is real, when it may be lacking in other areas. Now, if you're lacking in issues or areas where you're trying to show that the business is real, the investment amount, increasing the investment amount can also help. Investing in more equipment, investing in advertising, legal fees, and employees, raising that investment amount in some way, to help set up that business, get that business running, could also help to strengthen your case.
Perfect. And John, when we talked about the kind of like the E-2 investment and the E-2 visa expenditures, what are some like the most common E-2 visa expenditures, and can you really kind of include like anything you purchase for the US company, or are some expenditures kind of stronger than the others?
Yeah, again, you're always coming from the area of, is this expenditure necessary for the business? That's where you're starting from. So if it's doubtful, you may have issues having the examiner credit it to the expenses towards the business. One example is that we typically encounter is an applicant or a client trying to use a vehicle as a business expense. If your business is strictly an office-based business, probably not going to work, because it's not, you can't really justify how that vehicle is necessary for the business. saying that it's going to be used for commuting is not going to be sufficient. However, if it's a business that requires travel to provide a service, so you're talking about maybe a cleaning service, a delivery service, oh, absolutely, that vehicle is definitely necessary for the business, and you'll easily be able to use that as an appropriate expense. Some other examples of good expenditures you could be looking at. We've already mentioned some of these, but we'll throw in some that we haven't mentioned. Setting up the website again, the computer equipment, printers, scanners, tablets, iPads, especially for an office-based business. The actual inventory. So for a retail business, you're going to be selling merchandise. The actual purchase of that merchandise will help as well. The furniture, again, making sure that it's a furniture appropriate for the business, desks, chairs, sofas, perhaps for a reception area if you're going to have one. Any type of purchase towards intellectual property, trademarks, that'll work as well. Expenses towards employees or payroll, contractors, legal fees to help set up the business, prepayment of leases towards the business, the rental space, setting up the business entity, office supplies, phones, utilities. Certain types of training courses might be able to apply, but they don't always. So we'd have to kind of look at that. We mentioned licensing fees, trade show appearances, purchase of real property if it's going to be used for the business. That's fair game as well. Software and like I said before, advertising.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Great. So now I'm going to go over some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses. So theoretically, for consulting businesses or any kind of like businesses that provide services, or as John mentioned, kind of like these office-based businesses. So the problem with those is that, theoretically, you can invest very little money into that business. And if you invest, I don't know, $5,000, let's say, theoretically, you could start this type of business. But this is kind of an issue for the E-2 visa, because the E-2 visa is still an investor visa, and the government wants to see that you have made a substantial investment in the E-2 company, and that you are committed to starting the company, and you are kind of like serious about starting the company. So for an E-2 visa, investments such as let's say $5,000 or $8,000 like that would unfortunately be too low. You also want to, when kind of like investing money and kind of like thinking, like what is kind of like the minimum amount of money I can invest, you also want to put yourself in the shoes of the adjudicating officer. So, if you only invest very little money, $5,000 to $10,000, and you put yourself into the shoes of the officers, the officer just kind of like may conclude that that you are not committed to kind of like starting the business, and that the investment is just too low. So, for these types of cases, for consulting businesses or for kind of like service-oriented businesses, we want to kind of like increase the investment amount. And I will say, like, for consular filings, kind of like the minimum, the kind of like the absolute minimum we would want to see spend is around like $35,000-$40,000. But even those types of cases would at some consulates be very risky cases, again, because some consulates are just kind of like used to see even kind of like much larger investments than that. So, how can you kind of increase your investment? So let's say that you are starting a consulting business, you bought a computer, you signed a lease with WeWork, and, you just kind of like really are not sure, like what else can you spend money on? So I will say, like one type of expenditure that is really good to, help you with kind of like raising the investment amount is the office space. So what you can do is, you can prepay your office space for, let's say 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. and kind of like everything you pay, in advance, like all of that money you will be able to include as part of your investment. So that is like one area, one expenditure, like how you can create, raise the investment amount. You can also, invest in marketing or any kind of like the expenditures as John just went over. And then one other thing you can do to kind of like raise the investment amount is to hire employees, and this will help you in two different areas. So it will help you to raise the investment amount because any kind of any money, any payments you make to the employees before we submit the application to the consulate, like all of those payments you will be able to include as part of your E-2 investment. And it will also be helpful to kind of show that the business is not marginal. As John already mentioned, there is a requirement that ideally the business will have 3 to 4 employees by year 5 of operations. But if you already have 1 employee, before you even come to the US on the E-2 visa, like that's gonna help the case extremely. So, these are just some tips, how you can strengthen the your E-2 visa application if you are applying through a consulting business. Perfect.
Okay.
So now,
All right. I'll shoot off some questions for you. How's that? So do you have to have employees before filing an E-2 visa application?
yeah, so if you are applying for through a startup, you don't have to have employees before you get the E-2 visa. It's as I mentioned, it's definitely helpful. Like if you have one, even one employee, it's gonna help the case tremendously. If you have multiple employees, that's gonna be extremely helpful for the application. But I would say like the majority of cases we do for new companies, they don't have any employees, before the investor comes to the US, so it's not required.
Thank you. Yeah, it could make for a potentially better case, but it's not an actual requirement.
Yeah.
What do you think about real estate projects? Do you think they would make good E-2 visa cases?
Yeah, so we get this question a lot, people asking like, can I buy a property in the US and can I rent it, and then can I apply for an E-2 visa like based on that? So unfortunately, if your plan is to just kind of purchase one or even multiple properties, but you only plan to rent them and the only income is going to be from rent payments of the tenants, like that's not going to work for the E-2 visa, because as John mentioned in the beginning, the E-2 visa company or the E-2 company has to be real and operating. So the E-2 company either has to sell products to clients or has to provide services to clients. The company has to be active. The company has to have employees eventually. So if the only kind of income from the company comes from rent payments, like that's just not going to work for the E-2 visa. Some kind of successful E-2 visa petitions we did in the real estate kind of industry are, for example, real estate brokerage firms, brokerage firms that have real estate agents and the agents sell properties, those are good for the E-2 visa. Other type can be, if your company is a real estate management company. So let's say that you have a company and that company manages, many like homes or apartment buildings in certain areas, that's completely fine for an E-2 visa. You can set up a company that will be doing house renovations or construction, house construction companies, those are fine for the E-2 because again, you will be providing services. You will, most likely need to hire employees or contractors. So that's, real estate renovation construction companies are completely fine. And, house flipping company. So if your company, if you want to, buy properties, flip them, and then sell them. I will say, those could work potentially, but you would have to be doing the house flipping on a very large scale. So we have done an E-2 visa for these types of companies, but the companies were really flipping, I would say like 100, 150 like houses per year. They were doing it on a very large scale, and those were approved. But if your plan is to kind of buy 2-3 properties per year and flip them and then sell them, like that's that would not work. So house flipping could work, with a caveat that it has to be done on a very large scale.
Sure, that makes sense. The larger the scale, perhaps the better the case in that area.
Exactly.
Are there any kind of cases you consider risky for E-2 visas?
Yeah, so the kind of like the real estate the industry, those could be risky. The types of cases I just went over, we have done those. But so you just have to be aware like what's allowed for the E-2 visa in the real estate industry. Another types of cases could be if you want to set up a company that will be doing equity trading. So that could be possible, but again, if your goal is to kind of set up a company and place your stock portfolio, your own stock portfolio into this company, and just kind of like manage your stock portfolio through this company, like that would not work. And again, just because the company is really like not providing any services to any clients, you are just kind of like managing your own stock portfolio through the company. Now, if that company would you would submit a business plan, and at the time of applying, you would be able to perhaps submit contracts with clients or letters of intent with potential clients, and you would be able to demonstrate that yes, you already have clients, or you will have additional clients other than you in the future. That could work. But yeah, those could be risky. And another thing just to keep in mind about both kind of like the equity trading companies and the real estate companies is that these industries are usually very kind of like heavily regulated. So you definitely want to check, but this is a general kind of tip for any sort of company, is that you always want to check like what licenses you need to start a particular company, because USCIS can always ask to see that you have all the licenses you need. So you want to definitely double check on that.
Sure, makes sense. Thank you. And what have you seen as potential reasons why E-2 visas are denied?
Yeah, so one reason can be that the investment amount is just too low. So as I mentioned, if someone invests like $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, that type of investment is just too low. So that can be one reason for denial. Kind of like the good thing about that reason for denial is that you can always reapply for the E-2 visa and just invest more money. So the good thing is in the sense that at least what to address, like what to fix, and if you invest more money, the case may still be approved if you reapply. Another type of reason for denial is just kind of like the nature of the business. So as I went over some of the kind of like the types of cases or industries, just some industries are just kind of like more risky. So I would say like for these types of cases, you definitely want to consult with a lawyer, like what is fine for an E-2 visa and what is not. Another reason or just kind of like consideration to keep in mind is the filing location or venue or where you will be applying. So, some consulates just want to see kind of like, or are used to seeing just very large investment amounts. So for example, in our experience, the US consulates in Japan, they are used to these, large companies investing, hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, and then just kind of like sending a lot of E-2 employees to the US. So these consulates, are just used to see these large investment amounts. So if you want to apply there and your investment amount is around like $40,000-$50,000, just because the consulates are not used to these types of amounts, your case could be denied, but could be approved at another consulate. So the filing location or the filing venue is definitely, a thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that, if you have a business in your home country, that is kind of, and you are running a business in the same industry, and then you want to start a business in the same industry in the US, the consular officer could ask you, or could ask to see the revenues of the business in your home country, and could ask you, like how many employees have you had in your home country, just to kind of see, or just to kind of like make sure that you will be able, to have employees in the US. So let's say that you have had a company in your home country for 10 years and you never hired any employees, and then you want to start the same company in the US. The consular officer, may be concerned whether you will be able to hire employees in the US. Now, this can always be explained, like you can explain, like why the US company will be able to hire employees, but this is definitely something to keep in mind, and the officer can ask about this. Another, reason for denial could be that the officer, was concerned whether the US company will create jobs in the US. So, like let's say that, you submit a business plan with your application, and the business plan only shows that the revenues in the next 5 years are always going to be around like $100,000. And are not going to be kind of like increasing over years. The consular officer could again just be concerned that, based on the revenue predictions and based on the business plan, and just kind of like based on the type of business, the company will not be able to hire employees. Another kind of like reason for denial can just be, if you had any issue with the adjudicating officer. So let's say that the interview just didn't go well. Unfortunately, the consular officers have huge discretion, for kind of like approving, denying the cases. Or let's say that you have a previous visa denial on record, that could all kind of like play a role in the kind of like in the final decision. In our experience, even people who have had like one or even multiple kind of like, let's say, B visa denials, they can still apply for an E-2. But if you in past had any kind of like issue with adjudicating officer, like that could play a role in kind of like the final decision. And the kind of like the last reason for denial could be that you just didn't meet the requirements, the E-2 visa requirements at the time of filing. So we see this mostly, when people don't hire an attorney and they apply for an E-2 visa themselves. Sometimes they are denied, and then they come to us and we review the application. And sometimes the kind of like the basic requirements were just not met at the original visa petition. So like let's say that someone just doesn't own at least 50% in the business, someone just owned 25%, like then the basic requirement is just not met. So yeah, that could be another kind of like reason for the denial.
All right. Thank you. And how about changing my business? Can I change a business after I start it?
Yeah, so you can, you can change. So it will kind of depend on like what's the change. So like let's say that the business you already started, you originally started was, let's say, I don't know, like a restaurant, and now you want to provide like consulting services in the restaurant and like food industry, yes, you can start doing that, and you probably would be able to start doing that even, without us kind of like going to the consulate or going to USCIS. And asking them for kind of permission to do this. Now, let's say that you originally started a restaurant and now you want to, I don't know, you want to also be providing like software, I don't know, like consulting in the software, industry. Like that, for that type of change, we would probably need to go back to the consulate, to USCIS, inform them of this change, and then once we have the approval, then you would be able to kind of like start this additional line of business. So I will say, like, if the change is or if the new business is kind of like related to what you were doing originally, then you wouldn't necessarily need the approval of the government. But if it's just something completely different, then you would need the approval from the government before you start doing that.
Right on. Thank you. Let's see, maybe let's get through some of these questions we have. Let's see, the first one I'm seeing, if I am buying business with U.S. citizen partner, my stake will be 51%. If business cost is around 400,000, do I need to invest 202,000 as a cash? Or can I invest 150,000 and my U.S. partner can invest 100K in cash? And can we arrange remaining amount by business loan? I'll take a crack at it, Michaela, and obviously, and if I'm missing anything. Yeah, so the important part is that you have to show 50% ownership, and that could potentially be demonstrated as well by the amount of money that's used to invest or purchase a business. So if there's if it's unbalanced as far as how much investment is being made by one partner, that could affect the government's determination of who is the majority owner of that business. So I say, be on the safe side. You should spend at least half of what's required towards the business, if not more. I wouldn't dabble in anything lower than that. And if you're going to be taking out a business loan, again, that business loan, I would say that amount being, in other words, that amount, the amount that you're going to be invested, show that you're owning 50% or more of the business. And if you need that business loan to substantiate that amount, that loan probably be in your name as much as possible. You have any thoughts on that, Michaela?
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, it sounds kind of like a complex, situation. So it may be, again, good to schedule a consult or discuss this with an attorney, like before you transfer the money. But generally, yes, you would want to submit an evaluation, like how much is the business worth, and then you want to show that you personally invested the funds to purchase, or 51% of the business, and then you need to show source of the funds for the 51%. Like, even if it's in cash, you would need to submit evidence, like what's the source of the cash. And then for the business loan, yes, you would want to submit the loan agreement. And just one thing to keep in mind is that loans are generally fine for the E-2 visa, but the loan cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So if it's a loan, it could be, I don't know, secured by your house or your personal assets, but not by the E-2 company's assets. So that's also very important to keep in mind.
Certainly. Thank you. I could take the next one. It says, I am currently being sponsored by my father to the U.S. under the F3 category, but the processing will take a few years. If I apply for an E-2 visa, will my F3 sponsorship be impacted? No. So you're talking about a green card petition by your father, I believe, as the married son or daughter of a U.S. citizen parent. So any kind of non-immigrant visas or temporary visas that you're applying for won't impact your green card application. However, green card applications and most temporary visa applications may impact the temporary visa application, especially if you're applying from a visa from the consulate. So there's no real formula, and it's not a surety that your temporary or the E-2 visa will be impacted, but it does open the door for the adjudicating officer to suspect that perhaps you're intending to come into the US to live here, which goes against the purpose of the E-2 or the temporary visa. So that's what you have to kind of keep in mind if you want to go through that process.
Exactly.
All right. Let's see. The next one asks, can an E-2 visa holder do other businesses as well, like stocks or general real estate rental type businesses? You want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so like selling stocks, or taking money, like if you own like a property and taking rent, like that's fine. I would say like as long as you are able to explain, like you just kind of like do this, like in your free time, like apart from the E2 business, just kind of like for yourself, that's fine. If you would be doing like, I don't know, as I said, kind of like the stock management, or like you would be, doing like property management or something like that on a large scale, then you would, and you would be receiving a lot of income from it, then you would want to kind of like add that to your, as part of your E2 company services. But if it's just for like, like you just do it in your own time, like that's, that's completely fine. Perfect.
Sounds
So another question, I'm planning to have 50% partnership with someone who owns Subway. Do I need to let Subway amend the agreement on my name, or not required? So this sounds kind of like a franchise kind of business type of case. Do you want to answer, John?
Sure. So I would say yes, because you want all your documentation regarding ownership and ownership percentages to be clear. So yes, I would say you do want any type of ownership agreement, purchase agreement to reflect your name on it.
Exactly. Then the next question is, hello, I'm an F1 student and I'm looking to start a transport business, but at this time I cannot work under the F1. How could I be able to start the business? Yeah, so it kind of depends like where, like if you're currently here on OPT, or like whether you are here on the grace period. I would say like you can do some activities like like for example setting up like an LLC, like setting up a bank account, like activities like that like would be allowed, just kind of like activities to kind of like start the E2 company. But yeah, you would definitely like not be able to perform work for the company. If you are planning to do a change of status with USCIS, it may be good to kind of like hire someone, like hire an employee. So like at the time we are submitting the application and like USCIS sees that you are here as a student, they don't question like like what was done, like what activities you did. So like I would say like in this case, it may be good to hire an employee in the US who will kind of like help you with these activities. So then there are kind of like no questions as to like whether or not you violated your status. Perfect. Another question is, my wife is an American citizen. Can she be a partner in my E2 firm? I'm solely doing it for business purposes and not for future immigration. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think that should be fine. Again, as long as you respect the percentages requirement, 50%. The other partner can be anything. Could be a U.S. citizen, could be another foreigner. Just as long as your percentage is 50%. If you're concerned about the kind of like that intent to perhaps live in the United States, um, I think probably it won't be raised as an issue, but it's one of those kind of gray areas where I can't say for certain. It kind of depends on the examining officer, especially with the consulate. So it's always good to keep it in mind. Um, I would say probably not, but it's not a definitely no that it won't be an issue.
Exactly. So the next question is, I'm a Canadian citizen. If I apply for an E-2 at the Toronto consulate, commonly, what is the minimum investment amount your law firm has seen in recent successful cases? Is Toronto office receptive to low investment amounts? And how long is the wait time for an interview nowadays in Toronto? So yeah, I can answer this one. I would say like Toronto is like one of the consulates that are more receptive to lower investment amounts. I from the top of my head, I would say like the minimum invested, for the cases we have submitted was still around I would say like $45,000 spent, and then some additional money in working capital. So I would say like that would be kind of like the minimum, with a caveat like those would still be considered kind of like riskier cases. And if you have capacity to like hire an employee, or if the company, and you hire an employee and the company starts taking revenue, that would definitely help the application. So yeah, in my experience, like that would be kind of like the minimum, the absolute minimum we would want to see. And then how long do you wait for an interview nowadays? So in my experience, it's around like maybe around 4 months from the time you submit the application. You would be able to get an interview in about like 4 or 5 months. Anything to add, John?
No, I think that's about right. I've been seeing about 4 months as well.
Okay. And then after an E-2 approval, does my 5-year visa start immediately? After 2 years inside the US under E-2 studies, when I leave the US and re-enter, do I have to present all my business documents all over? Is there any risk of denial of re-entry at the end of 2 years while holding 5-year visa? So I can answer this one. So yes, so basically the 5-year visa period starts like when they issue the visa. After your interview, if they approve the visa, they will print the visa stamp in your passport, and the 5 years starts, it's kind of like specified on the visa stamp, but yes, it basically kind of like starts immediately. Now, the 2 years in E-2 status. So like, let's say that you enter the US and then you leave before the 2-year period mark. In my experience, like as long as your E-2 visa is still valid and you are just kind of like re-entering the US on the still valid E-2 visa, the border officials, the CBP officers generally like don't want to see any documents. Like in my experience, the most they would ask you is, like what company you work for, like what's your role, but like they don't want to see any documents, like no tax returns or anything like that. You would be basically presenting that like at the time you are renewing your E-2 visa. Perfect. So next question is, on which visa can I visit the US to explore business opportunities in person before applying for an E-2 visa? Do you want to answer, John, this one?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably come in on a visitor visa, a B1, B2. Will probably be, you'll be able to do that under that.
Exactly. Another question, I sell art, home decor online in Australia. Can I start this online selling business in the US, and would pop-up retail stores in the US qualify for an E-2? So yes, definitely, I don't see any issue. So as long as you invest, make the substantial investment, invest the money in the US and meet all the other requirements, definitely you can start this type of business. Next question is, my husband and I have Mexican and Canadian passports, and we worked legally in the US before. The SSN will change if we decide to get an E-2 visa. Also, what passport is better to use when we apply? In my understanding, like once you get an SSN, it's gonna be always gonna be the same numbers, so it's not going to change. And which passport is better. So you would just want to check like the reciprocity schedule for how many years, because I know Canadian nationals can get the E-2 visa for 5 years. My recollection is Mexican nationals can get it for 4 years only. So that's maybe, that may be one thing to consider, that, with Canadian passports, it's going to be issued for longer. But yeah, you may want to check on that. And but yeah, that may be a factor, why the Canadian passport may be better to use. Next question is 50,000 considered enough for a startup in a moving or a junk removal company? Do you want to answer, John?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we're always going to kind of go back to whether that amount's going to be enough to really start the company, right? We'd have to know a little bit more about the type of business you're going to be starting. Off the top of my head, I imagine there's going to be a need for a vehicle, a significant heavy duty type of vehicle, perhaps, in this type of business. So, is that going to be enough? Is that going to be within that $50,000 budget that you're contemplating, or are you going to need more? Are you going to need more employees? Can you do it? Is this a one-man service, or are you going to and you can't do the work yourself, right? You need more, that you actually need employees to carry out the junk and dispose of it. So I'm not going to say for sure. I can't really say for sure 50,000 is going to be enough. It could be, but just keep in mind, this is definitely going to require employees, other than the fact that the E-2 requires it, the manpower that you're going to need, the equipment that you're going to need. And then are you going to have an office space with office equipment and stuff like that? That's what you have to kind of look at and break down to see if that budget is going to be enough or if you're going to need more.
Exactly. So then the next question is, what happens if I invest in a business in the US and my E-2 visa does not get approved? Is there an appeal process, or do I start all over again? Yeah, so this is definitely like one of the, like risky aspects of the E-2 visa, or, just the fact that, yes, you have to make this substantial upfront investment in the E-2 company, in the US company, and then at the end of this, the E-2 visa may not be approved. So, if you are applying at a consulate and your application doesn't get approved, depending on what the reason is for denial, you can always reapply. There is not really an option to appeal the process, just because if you're applying at a consulate, the officers just have huge amount of discretion and you cannot really appeal their decision, but you can always reapply. So let's say that the application was denied because again, like the investment amount was low, or that because the officer doesn't think that you'll be able to hire employees. Like those are things you can kind of address in your reapplication. And we have seen in many cases, even if initial application is not approved, the reapplication can always be approved. So yeah, that would be the kind of like the procedure. Then the next question is, what is the minimum amount invested that you have ever seen? I want to incorporate a dog walking business and it requires little amount of money. What do you think, John?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because when you think about a dog walking business, you might be thinking, well, I don't really need that much money to start it. You're just going to be walking dogs around town. But you have to be smart and a bit creative with this situation, because we like we've been saying, 50,000 is kind of like that safe bet investment, right? That probably will get you in the clear, assuming the business allows for that. It's not one of those heavy machinery type of businesses that clearly requires more. If you're looking to invest less because the business doesn't require that much, you might have a case, but now we're getting into kind of like that dicey, nervous kind of area anyway. You're going to have to depend more substantially on arguing and explaining why this business requires a lesser amount of investment. You also want to look at, potentially building up this business on a larger scale. So, maybe you want to hire more employees to attract more customers to increase revenue. So it's just not just maybe hiring one dog walker, maybe hiring 5 or 6, and that could get you up to a good amount of investment, even though maybe you don't really need equipment so much for that. So it's a situation where it's definitely a doable case. We just have to kind of really think about how we want to present the case in terms of the expenditures that you're going to be making towards the business. Maybe not necessarily as what's necessary, but what'll make the case more presentable as far as an investment amount.
Exactly. And I would say, like, even in types of cases like where you don't need a lot of equipment, like you may want to invest in marketing to just kind of show that, yes, you have a plan, like how you will attract customers and things like that. Perfect. So the next question is there a time period that the new business must be launched? Must the business be operational within 12 months from the visa? So John, like once the E-2 visa stamp is issued, like is there a time period, the E-2 investor has to enter in the US or is there not?
Well, so I'm going to take it a little bit farther than the stamping of the visa, because I think there's 2 ways you could look at this issue or this problem. One is when you're applying for the visa, you always want to keep in mind that you want to be presenting a case that's either already operating or it's close to being in operation. If there's an indication that it's not close to being in operation, you're at risk that they'll deny approving the visa. Then the other way you want to look at it is renewal time. So there is no real statutory or legal period of time that you have to get the business running. But the more of an unexplained delay in running it, I think can potentially affect it when you go back to renewal. There are ways to make up for it. Obviously, if even if you're delayed for a year, if that second year you're generating great revenue, you're hiring substantial amount of employees, it's probably not going to matter at the renewal stage. But if in year 2, year 3, year 4, the business is kind of stagnant, it's struggling, then that first year of not really being in operation is going to really affect that case or that business.
Exactly. And in case like there is any I don't know, like personal reasons, we have cases like that when someone kind of got the visa and then they didn't come for a certain period of time because they were just having, because of like personal or family reasons, like that can always be explained. But you would definitely want to explain that. And great tips, John. Then another question is a Canadian business startup loan, unsecured personal loan, allowed to use towards starting up an E-2 business in the US? So I don't see, loans, as we said, like loans are fine for the E-2 visa. You would just want to submit the loan agreement and then evidence that you received the money from the bank or company, and then transfer of the funds to the US. The only caveat with the loan is that it cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 company. But if it's unsecured personal loan, that's fine for an E-2 visa. Another question is, I want to start a ride-sharing business in the US. Can buying vehicles be shown as appropriate expense? So definitely yes. This is like one type of business, or one of the types of businesses where buying vehicles we can definitely include in the investment schedule. So definitely yes. Another question, is there any negative impact if I partner with my US relative 50-50 in the business? Can it count as my expense investment if my US entity has already paid for inventory and the inventory has been sold already? The new business is already operational with the help of US relative. Let's see. So I would say, partnering with your relative is generally, if you kind of like buy, a business from your relative, like that can have a negative impact on the E-2 visa application. But in this case, I think you are just kind of like buying a business 50-50, so that's fine. And then, John, do you understand the second part of the question? Can it count as at my expense if my US entity has already paid for inventory and the inventory has been sold already. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand.
Yes, I think he's asking if he already purchased the inventory or the merchandise, and if you already sold it, if he could still use it. I think he's asking if he could use that as an expense or evidence that the business is already operational. I would say yes. I mean, as long as you could document whatever you purchase. Yeah, I don't think they're going to look at whether you sold the inventory. They're just going to look. They want documentation showing that you made the expense. You know, in an invoice, bank statements. That's what they're going to be looking at, and that's what they're going to be counting towards the investment.
Perfect. Next question is, so the minimum amount for a service-based business is 30,000. So yes, I'm gonna say like there is no set minimum amount like in the regulation. Like what is going to be substantial investment is gonna be, you know, is gonna be different for different types of businesses. So what we do is we look at an investment schedule, and then we make recommendations, and we provide advice based on what we see in the investment schedule. So I would say 30,000 is very, very, very low for an E2 and would be risky in, you know, would be risky application. But yeah, it's just going to be what is kind of like what is sufficient is just going to be different for different types of businesses. And I would say like the kind of like 40,000 spend would be, you know, kind of like the minimum we would want to see at consulates. The next question is, would a dog sitting boarding business be considered ineligible for an E2 visa? No, so definitely you can, you know, it's definitely eligible. Like you can definitely do this. I haven't done any E2 for a dog sitting boarding business, but we have done you know, cases for like a dog salons and things like that. So it's definitely eligible. You just want to show that you meet all the E2 visa requirements. Perfect. So maybe let's answer a couple more. I'm currently considering investing in an existing consultancy that provides services to US government by purchasing 50% of the value of the company. The 5-year plan is to split and establish my own consultancy that I own 100%. Would this be possible under the E2 visa? So what do you think, John?
So I to start, I think we should probably talk to you during the consultation to really understand the circumstances of the case. In an attempt to answer your, you know, partially answer your question today, I think that might be problematic because what you want to show is the viability of the current business that you're starting or you're buying, that it's going to generate revenues. I think what you're proposing, if I'm understanding it correctly, where you're going to be splitting off, starts to create doubt into the viability that this is whether it's a real business or it's a business that's going to be in operation for a long-term period of time. You know, to continue generating revenues and employees. So that starts to create doubt with what I think you're proposing. So I think that may be problematic in this case.
Perfect. So the next question is, do the consulate require a franchise agreement for an E2 visa, or they only require a corporation agreement? Yeah, so we have already answered this, I believe. So, you know, if you're purchasing a franchise, we definitely want to submit like all the franchise documents. How long does it take to get the visa? So this is just very specific at which consulate you are applying at. It can take anywhere to get an interview, anywhere from like 3 months up to, you know, like many more months. So this is just going to depend to where you are applying. Is it okay not to amend any agreement with my partner has with Subway and just plan to amend only his corporations? Yeah, so I think we already, this is the question about the franchise. So yeah, I think you know, you would want to amend like any sort of like corporate documents, but then you would also want to submit like the documents that, you know, the franchise documents to show that, you know, you like you will be the one kind of like running the franchise. So you would want to do both.
You don't want to be too creative with these ownership related documents. You want to make it as clear as possible who owns what when you're submitting an E-2 visa application. Any kind of doubt that you're creating, you could be risking a denial.
Perfect. Does motel or gas station conventional business qualify for E-2 visa with seller financing? So gas stations do qualify for an E-2, but seller financing, my understanding is that, in seller financing, the assets of the E-2 company would be, kind of the object of the kind of, of the agreement. So that would not be allowed. So gas stations are fine, but not with the seller financing. Then next question, please, can you expand on showing intent to come back? I want to apply for an E-2 from the UK. I'm in a process of marriage separation, but also have a green card sponsorship. This is years away. Do you want to answer quickly, John, this one?
Yeah, again, there's not much to say because there's no real formula or rule book on this. All I could tell you is that the E-2 is a visa that doesn't lead to a pathway to a green card. So if the officer sees that there could be an indication that you intend on permanently living in the United States, which can be created, that suspicion can be created by a green card petition, it can be fair game to scrutinize either the application or even your entry into the United States. Now, in most cases, that doesn't really happen a whole lot, but it is something that could happen. And unfortunately, I can't give you 100% clear answer on that. All I could give you is that it's a possibility. It doesn't happen often, and you have to weigh the risk if you want to move forward with it.
Perfect. The next question is, how do I bring my kid who is 21 years old to the US? Also, widowed parent who is dependent on you, how can I bring them? Yes, I would say bringing a child over 21, an F1 student visa may be an option, but you would just want to, schedule a consultation so we can kind of advise you on, all possible options. Perfect. The next question, is, are we allowed to provide services? At this time, I'm considered a tourist. Would I be allowed to provide services? Do you want to answer, John?
Sure. So that's a bit of a tricky question. You're not supposed to be employed in any kind of way in the United States. So the answer is probably no. However, if it's a business that you're contemplating in owning, you could always hire employees to manage and provide the services. And so you can collect payment. It just can't be for direct work that you provide, but you can hire workers to operate the business for you.
Perfect. The next question is it easy to move E-2 visa to a green card? So yeah, this is a very kind of, we would need to know the specifics of your situation. It can be, maybe not, but yeah, we would just need more details. But again, one thing to keep in mind is that the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa. The green card is a, immigrant visa. So yeah, we would just need to know the specifics to figure out the timing and things like that.
We should also have webinars, I think, on that where we discuss potential avenues.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can definitely watch the recording or sign up for a future webinar. The next question is, can Canadians get the E-2 visa on the border? So no. So the E-2 is one of the, I think one of the very few visas the Canadians actually have to go to a consulate and apply and get a visa stamp in their passport. So it's not possible to just apply at the border. Next question, is it easier and better to do E-2 visa from inside the US, and is it easy to change it to green card, and if yes, how many months it may take to transfer to green card? So again, whether it's better to apply with USCIS or a consulate, and in some cases it may be better, some cases it may not. So yeah, I recommend to schedule up a consultation and just kind of discuss your particular situation, and then we can decide on the filing venue. The next question, is there a time period that the new business must be launched? Okay, I think we went over this. The next question, in case the new US business is running at a loss in the first years and it is no longer sustainable to continue running it, would the E-2 visa be revoked? And is there a minimum sales requirement to show that we can sustain the business? Do you want to answer, John?
Sure. So we kind of have to look at what you're looking at is when you're going to be dealing with the renewal process in the next 5 years, right? So no, I mean, you're not going to get a revocation letter or anything like that if the business is struggling. The issue is going to come up on renewal. That is clear. Then the question is going to be, what is the business going to be looking like when you're approaching that renewal period? So we're going to have to look at it holistically to see what was the cause of the struggling period. Obviously, what we want to try and do is highlight any periods where the business was succeeding and generating positive revenue. Also, the hiring of employees, again, always critical. Was the business able to hire employees? So, it's kind of like a sinking ship, but, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sunk. It's looking at the whole 5-year period to see what can we salvage for that renewal of the visa. So definitely you're going to need to talk to us to kind of go over the situation to see if we can save that case.
Exactly. Perfect. So the next question is, if you do have a moving business, can the E-2 visa holder be the owner operator? So definitely, yes. The E-2 visa holder can be the owner because you have to show that you own at least 50%. As to like whether you can be the operator or kind of like be providing the services. So for an E-2 visa, we want to show that you will have kind of like a managerial or executive role for the E-2 company, and that you will hire employees to kind of like do, to either, provide services or sell products to the actual customers. I would say like if you do this like in the beginning, that's fine, but kind of like eventually you want to hire employees. Perfect. Do you want to take over, John, over these last questions?
Sure. So could you provide a bit detail on your E-2 services once you retain your law firm? What kind of help will I get from your firm? How much is the E-2 legal fee from your firm? Thanks. So we pretty much we will put the application together for you. There's, depending on where you're applying, whether it's USCIS or the consulate, there are different application forms, but they essentially ask the same thing. So we'll prepare that for you. We'll prepare the documents that will be presented to the consulate. We will review the process where you're either purchasing the business or you're putting together the investment so that we can guide you whether it's an appropriate business, and also as far as the source of the money to make sure you document that appropriately. Now, as far as fees, we'll usually discuss that during the consultation. We usually provide flat fees depending on the case and everything, and we'll be able to discuss that at the consultation. Does a new business have to be in operation in the U.S. if it is still an idea, business plan stage? What documents should we show towards the investment amount? Example, would forecasted inventory spend, forecasted commercial lease expense be sufficient? Okay, so what you have to keep in mind always is that the money has to be spent. There is no situation where you're waiting to spend the money. So essentially, you have to be past the idea or the business strategy part of creating the business, because you're actually spending money before you can apply for it. Now, when you mention forecasts, that has to do with the next 5 years, because that's a way to show that the business is it will meet the marginality requirements, or that it will be able to generate revenues to hire employees in the future. So if it's a new business that you're starting up, you have no past history to go on. So you do want to provide forecasts of what kind of revenues and hires the employee, the business will make in the future. In that situation, what we usually strongly recommend is the creation of a business plan that will show those forecasts for the future. Okay. Does the IRS take any tax on the investment capital? So I'm not very well versed on IRS or tax law. I want to say probably not, because they usually take is income revenues. So I mean, any kind of money that you receive will be taxed. So I'll go as far as that. Other than that, you may need to speak to an accountant on that. Michaela, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, definitely speak with an accountant or a tax advisor, and yeah, they'll be able to advise you on that.
Yeah. What is the UK consulate stance on investment amount? Are they on the low end or high end? Michaela, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so again, I would say like you know, like like it just kind of, it's gonna be like depending on, you know, like what type of business you are starting, and you again, you know, you want to show that, you know, that you spend you know, like everything you needed to spend to start the particular business, or kind of like purchase the type of business you are purchasing. So like in my experience, I think, you know, the lowest we have submitted there, I think, I don't know, again, would be, you know, the very, very lowest would be around the 40, 50. But again, you know, like that was for a specific type of business. So again, it's just going to be dependent on, you know, like what type of business you are starting. And the last question, do you have to go to Toronto to process the E-2, or is there an option in Vancouver? So I can take this one. So basically for new E-2 companies, you have to apply in Toronto, like the kind of like the first application. But I believe like then the dependents can apply at other consulates. But the kind of like the initial E-2 has to be processed in Toronto. Perfect. Wow, so we got a lot of questions today. Thank you everyone for joining us. You know, hopefully you got a lot of helpful information. Hopefully we answered all your questions, and yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye everyone.